Whose child is this? The question came out of her flat and even. No rise at the end, no tremor, the way one might ask the hour. The Duke of Hartley stood in the center of the morning room, with the infant balanced against his forearm, as though he had been handed something molten, and for the length of 3 breaths he did not answer. The child, perhaps 8 months old, had a head of dark curls and a small, considering mouth, and eyes that were, even at that distance, unmistakable. Camilla had seen those eyes before. She had seen them across a ballroom, lowered in feigned modesty over a fan of painted silk, lifted again with the slow confidence of a woman who knew precisely what she was worth and intended to be paid it. She had a few seconds to decide how she would survive the next hour, and she spent 2 of them simply looking at the baby, who looked back at her without the faintest idea of the trouble it carried. The fire had burned low. A footman had laid it at 6, and it was now past 10, and no one had thought to feed it, because no one in this room had expected to remain in it. The card had come up an hour ago on a silver tray, a single line in a hand she did not recognize, and her husband had gone white reading it, and then gone out, and then come back through the garden door, of all doors, the servant's way, carrying this. She catalogued these facts the way she had been taught to catalogue everything since the age of 7, when her father had set a tray of small objects before her. Let her study it for the count of 30, then covered it and bid her name them all. She had named them all. She had always named them all. It was the one thing she could do that no one had ever found a use for, and she had long since stopped offering it. He said her name, Camilla. Only that, and then nothing. And she understood that he had no plan, that whatever had happened to him rather than been arranged by him, which was somehow both better and infinitely worse. A man with a plan could be reasoned with. A man undone by surprise was capable of anything, including the truth. The woman in the doorway had not yet spoken. Camilla had marked her on entering and had chosen deliberately not to look at her again, the way one does not look directly at the sun or at a creditor across a crowded room. She was younger than Camilla had imagined, which was its own small cruelty, and she wore a gown of deep wine-colored velvet that was too fine for mourning and too thin for the season. The gown of a woman who owned 2 good dresses and had worn the better one to this, knowing what this was. Her name was Séraphine Vauclair. Camilla knew this the way she knew most things, sideways and too late, from a remark dropped at a dinner she had pretended not to hear, from a milliner's bill that had crossed her desk in the spring and been paid without comment, because she ran the household accounts and her husband did not, and there had been an entry that did not fit, a sum for gloves and ribbon, sent to an address in a part of the city where the Duke of Hartley had no earthly business. She had noted it. She had filed it. She had said nothing because saying nothing was the skill they had bred into her in place of love, and she had been very well bred. Whose child? She said again, because he had not answered, and the silence had begun to set like plaster. He looked down at the baby as though the baby might answer for him. "It will not surprise you," he began, and Camilla felt the first true crack run through her composure, not at the words, but at the cowardice of them, the way a man who has wronged you will arrange the sentence so that your own foresight bears the blame. It will not surprise you, as though her noticing were the wound, as though by being clever enough to suspect she had somehow consented. "It does not surprise me," she agreed, and she watched the relief begin to surface in his face, and she let it. And then she said, "But I should like to hear you say it regardless, because I find I no longer trust the things I have arranged to believe." That stopped him. It stopped the woman in the doorway, too. Camilla saw, at the edge of her vision, a hand rise to the velvet at the throat and press there. A small, involuntary thing, and she filed that gesture away with the others. She was not in that moment thinking of revenge. She was thinking, with the cold, clear part of her mind that had never once been allowed out of the schoolroom, that this child had been brought here into her house in daylight by her husband, through the servant's door, which meant it had been brought for a reason, and the reason was not confession, because confession does not require an audience of 3. The reason was that something had gone wrong elsewhere. The reason was that the child had nowhere else to go. She crossed the room. She had not decided to. Her feet had decided for her, the way they had decided, 12 years ago at her own wedding, to carry her up an aisle she had not chosen toward a man she had met 4 times. She stopped in front of her husband and she looked at the baby properly for the first time, and the baby, with the appalling friendliness of the very young, reached for the jet beads at her wrist and got a fistful of them and pulled hard and made a sound of triumph. Camilla did not pull her hand away. She let the small fingers tighten. They were warm. That was the thing she had not braced for. She had braced for the resemblance, for the eyes, for the humiliation of it, for the servants who would already be whispering at the back stairs. She had not braced for warmth, for the particular damp heat of a baby's hand, for the way it undid in a single second a thing she had spent 12 years constructing out of silence and good posture. "Take it," the woman in the doorway said suddenly, and her voice was not what Camilla expected either. It was hoarse and very tired, and it had no flirtation left in it at all. "Take her. I cannot keep her. I have tried, and I cannot, and he knows I cannot, and there is no one else." "Her," Camilla repeated. "A girl, then." "A girl," said Seraphine Beauclair, and for a moment the 2 women looked at each other directly over the head of the child and the bowed head of the man between them. And something passed in that look that had nothing to do with him at all, that was older than him, and would outlast him. An understanding between 2 people who had each, in her own way, been spent like a coin and dropped and forgotten. "Her name is Juliet," the woman said. "I named her for no one. I wanted her to belong to no one but herself." She gave a small, terrible laugh. "I did not manage even that." Camilla held still. She was aware of the fire dying behind her, of the gray light through the tall windows, of her husband's breathing, of the clock on the mantel that had been her grandmother's and that ticked, she now noticed for the first time in years, slightly fast. She was aware that whatever she said next would be the hinge of the rest of her life, and that everyone in the room knew it, and that they were all in their different ways afraid of her, which was novel and not entirely unpleasant, and which she was honest enough with herself to recognize as a poor foundation. She did not say the thing she might have said. She did not turn to her husband and ask how long, and how often, and whether he had loved the woman, or merely used her because the answers to those questions would change nothing about the warm hand currently destroying the clasp of her bracelet. And because she had learned long ago that the questions we ask in such moments are rarely the ones we want answered, we ask them to wound. She had been wounded enough this morning to last a year, and she found she had no appetite to deal it back. Instead, she said to the woman, "How old is she?" 8 months on Tuesday," said Seraphine. "And you have fed her this morning?" A pause. "At dawn." There was a little left. Camilla turned at last and looked at her husband, and she saw that he was waiting for the storm, braced against it, almost yearning for it, because the storm would have been a kind of absolution, a thing that happened to him rather than a thing he must now choose. She had spent 12 years giving this man exactly what he expected of her. It had been, she understood now, a slow form of disappearance. She decided, standing there with a stranger's daughter pulling at her wrist, that she was finished, disappearing. "Ring for Mrs. Aldous," she said, and her voice did the flat, even thing again, the steady thing, the thing that made footmen move quickly. "We will need warm milk and a clean basket, and someone sent to the village for a wet nurse before noon. The blue room at the end of the east passage gets the morning sun. It will do until other arrangements are made." She heard the woman in the doorway make a small sound, and she heard her husband say her name once more, in a tone she had never heard from him. a tone with something underneath it she did not yet have a name for, and she ignored them both. She looked down at the baby. The baby looked up at her with Seraphine Vauclair's eyes and Camilla's husband's chin, and an expression of perfect, unearned trust, and Camilla thought, with the small, dry corner of her mind that had survived everything, that the child at least had the decency to be beautiful, which was more than could be said for the situation. Whose child is this? She had asked, and she already had the answer, and she would have it differently before the end. But that is to run ahead, and a story told well is told slowly, and there was a great deal that came between the mourning and the mending, and it did not come easily, and it did not come fast. What no one in that room knew, what Camilla herself did not yet know, was that the card delivered an hour earlier had been the second card. The first had gone to a different house entirely, 3 days before, and had not been answered, and the silence of that known end was the true engine of everything that followed. But the household did not run on what people knew. It ran on what Camilla decided, and she decided, that morning, to keep the child. She did not decide it out of saintliness. She would have been the first to deny any such thing. She decided it because in the space of a quarter of an hour, she had watched 2 people who were supposed to be powerful become helpless, and she had recognized in their helplessness the shape of her own life. And she had thought very clearly in words, not this one. Whatever else is broken, not this one. The girl would not be passed, hand to hand, and spent, and dropped. She would belong to someone who had chosen her, even if that someone was the wife of the man who had betrayed her, standing in a cold room, with the fire gone out, holding a stranger's child by one small insistent fist. Mrs. Aldous arrived. The household began to move the way a household does, absorbing scandal into routine, and the basket was found, and the milk was warmed, and the woman in the wine-colored velvet was shown, at Camilla's instruction, into the small parlor rather than out the door. The Duke of Hartley stood in the middle of his own morning room and did not know what to do with his hands, and Camilla, passing him on her way to the bell, paused. She did not touch him. She looked at him for a long moment, taking inventory the way she had been taught, naming everything she saw. Then she said quite gently, which frightened him more than shouting would have, "We will speak tonight." And she went out, and the child went with her, and the fire, attended to at last by a footman with a guilty face, came reluctantly back to life behind them. The blue room at the end of the East Passage had not been used in years. It had been, in the first months of Camilla's marriage, the room she had hoped to fill, and it had stayed empty, year upon year, while she learned to stop hoping, and she had given up walking past it. Now she stood in its doorway with a basket on her arm, and a wet nurse summoned, and a stranger's daughter asleep at last against her shoulder, breathing the small, fast breaths of the very young, and she felt the floor of her life shift beneath her into a shape she did not recognize. Outside, the morning sun, which the room was famous for, came over the garden wall exactly as promised and lay across the cold hearth in a long, pale stripe. Camilla stood in it, the baby stirred and did not wake, and the day, having delivered its blow, went on as days do, indifferent and bright. Declining to comment on what it had done, she did not weep. She wanted to, and she noted the want, and she set it aside, the way she set aside everything, into the place where she kept the things she could not afford to feel during daylight. There would be a night for it. There was always a night for it, but the night, when it came, did not go at all the way she had arranged. The interview with Seraphine Vauclair took place at 3 in the small parlor, with the door shut and a maid posted outside it, not for propriety, but for the avoidance of listeners, and Camilla conducted it the way she conducted everything, sitting very straight, hands folded, giving nothing. She had expected to despise the woman. She found, to her irritation, that she could not quite manage it. Seraphine sat across from her with her two-dressed dignity and her exhausted eyes and answered every question without flinching, and her answers were not the answers of a schemer. There had been no plot to trap a duke. There had been a season, 2 summers past, and a man who had been kind to her when very few people were, and a thing that had grown out of loneliness on both sides and been for a while something almost like happiness, and then an ending managed badly. She had not told him about the child until the child was 4 months old and the small economies had run out. She had not wanted his money. She had wanted, she said, looking at the carpet, for the girl to know she had a father, even one who could never claim her, because she herself had not known hers, and she had felt the lack of it every day of her life, like a tooth that had been pulled. "And now," said Camilla, "and now I am dying," said Seraphine Vauclair simply, and lifted her eyes. And there was no self-pity in them, only fact. "The physician gives me until the autumn, perhaps the winter, if I am stubborn, and I have always been stubborn, so let us say the winter. I have no family. I have a sister in the north who will not have me, and certainly will not have her. I considered the foundling hospital." She paused. "I went so far as to stand at its gate, and then I could not. And I am not ashamed that I could not, and so I wrote to him, because he is the only person living who has any claim of blood on her, and I would rather she were raised in a house that resents her than die in one that has forgotten her." The fire ticked, the clock ran fast. Camilla sat with her hands folded and understood that the entire architecture of her morning's anger had been built on a foundation that no longer existed. She had prepared herself to fight a rival. She had been handed, instead, a woman 3 seasons from her grave, asking nothing for herself and everything for a child, and the cruelty Camilla had been holding ready turned to ash in her mouth, because there is no satisfaction in striking someone already falling. "She will not be resented," Camilla said. Before she had decided to say it, the words simply arrived, the way the milliner's bill had once arrived, an entry that did not fit and would have to be reckoned with. "Not in my house. I will not promise you that she will be loved, because I do not yet know whether I am capable of loving anything. It has been a long while since I was permitted to try. But she will not be resented. I will see to that. I am very good at seeing to things." Seraphine looked at her for a long moment, and then she did something Camilla had not braced for, the second unbraced for thing of a single day. She began, silently, to cry, without covering her face, the tears simply falling while she sat perfectly upright, and she said, "I had heard you were cold. The whole of the town says you are cold." "The town," said Camilla dryly, "has never once asked me what I am. There was an arrangement to be made, and Camilla made it, because making arrangements was the one form of power that had never been taken from her. Seraphine would not be turned out. She would be given the use of the dower cottage at the edge of the estate, quietly, under a name that was not her own, and she would be allowed to see the child as often as her strength permitted, for as long as she had strength, and when the strength was gone, she would be cared for properly, with a physician and a fire and clean linen, and she would not die at a foundling hospital gate. Camilla arranged all this in the level voice of a woman ordering linens, and she did not once present it as kindness, and Seraphine, who understood pride because she had survived on very little else, did not once thank her for it as kindness, and so the thing was done cleanly between them. 2 women settling a debt that neither of them had incurred and both of them would pay. It was only afterward, alone, that Camilla allowed herself to wonder what she had become in the space of a single day, and whether she would be able to explain it to her husband, and whether she wished to, and what, precisely, she now wanted, Amit's, having never truly had it, nor his apology, which would cost him little and mean less. What she wanted, she discovered sitting alone in the small parlor as the light went gold and then gray, was something she had never once asked for in 12 years of marriage, because she had not believed it was a thing one was permitted to ask. She wanted to be seen. She wanted, just once, for someone to look at the whole apparatus of her, the noticing, the cataloging, the silent management of a house and a husband, and now a child not her own, and to understand that it was not coldness. It had never been coldness. It had been love with nowhere to go, dammed up so long it had taught itself to look like stone. That evening he came to her as she had instructed, and the conversation they had was not the one either of them had rehearsed. He came at 9, after the household had been put to bed, and the child settled with the wet nurse in the blue room. And he came not as a duke, but as a man who had not slept, in his shirt sleeves, which she had not seen in years, and he stood by the cold hearth of her own sitting room, and did not sit until she bade him, which was itself a kind of She had spent the hour since the parlor deciding what she would say, drafting and discarding speeches the way she drafted and discarded everything, and in the end she said none of them, because he spoke first, and what he said dismantled her prepared composure as thoroughly as the baby's fist had dismantled her bracelet. "I have watched you all day," he said. "I have watched you arrange the saving of 2 people who had every reason to expect ruin from you, and I have watched you do it as though it cost you nothing, and I have understood finally 12 years too late that everything has always cost you something, and that I have spent our entire marriage mistaking your silence for indifference." When it was the sound of a person holding the world up alone, he stopped. His hands, she noticed, were not steady. "I went to her," he said, "because I was lonely, and you will say I had a wife, and no right to loneliness, and you would be correct. And that is the worst of it, Camilla. I was lonely in a house that contained you. I was starving at a full table because I never once thought to ask whether the woman across from me was starving too." She did not answer at once. She had learned, long ago, the power of the held silence, and she held it now, not as a weapon, but because she did not trust her voice. The fire was unlit, and neither of them moved to light it. The room was cold, and the cold was almost a relief, a clean, plain fact among so many complicated ones. "I do not forgive you," she said finally, "not because I wish to punish you. I find I have very little wish to punish you, which surprises me. I had expected to enjoy it more. I do not forgive you, because forgiveness is a door. And once I open it, we will simply walk back through into the house we lived in before, and I will not go back into that house." It was killing me by inches, and I had grown so accustomed to it that I mistook the dying for my character. He flinched at that, and she let him. "There is a child now," she went on, and her voice did at last the thing she had been guarding against. It thinned and caught, and she did not stop it. She let it be heard, which was, she understood, even as it happened, the bravest thing she had done in 12 years. "There is a child, and she did not ask to be born into the middle of our failures. And her mother is dying, and I have decided to keep her, and I did not decide it to spite you or to bind you or to play the saint. I decided it because she reached for me." She gave a short, laughing breath that was very close to a sob and was not quite either. "She reached for me. And no one has reached for me in a very long time, and I find I am not made of stone after all, which is inconvenient, because stone does not feel the cold, and I am suddenly very cold indeed." He crossed the room. He did not embrace her. He had wronged her too lately and knew it, and to his credit, he did not presume. He knelt instead beside her chair, which a duke does not do, and he took her hand, the one the baby had held that morning, and he turned it over and looked at it as though it were a document he had failed for years to read, and he said, "Then let me be cold beside you. I will not ask to be forgiven. I will ask only to be allowed to stay in the room to see you, to learn how, since I never troubled to learn before. I have a great deal of time owed, and I should like to begin repaying it, not as penance, but because I have discovered late and to my shame that I would rather be in your difficult company than in anyone's easy company in all the world." It was not a grand speech. He was not a man of grand speeches, which was perhaps why she believed it. She looked down at him kneeling in his shirt sleeves on her cold hearthrug. This man she had married as a stranger and lived beside as a stranger, and now saw, for the first time, as merely another person who had been lonely and afraid and had managed it badly, and she felt the dam she had built so carefully begin, not to burst. For she was incapable of bursting, but to seep to let through a thin, warm trickle of the thing she had stored behind it for so long. She did not say she loved him. She did not know yet whether she did. That would be the slow work of years, and she was honest enough not to counterfeit it. But she turned her hand within his, and she held it deliberately, the way the child had held it, and she let the silence between them become, for the first time in their marriage, not a wall, but a room, a place they were both inside of, together. "We will speak more," she said. "There is the cottage to arrange and the village to manage, and the question of what we tell the world, which I confess interests me less than it should. But for tonight, light the fire. I am tired of being cold. I have been cold for 12 years, and I find I have lost my taste for it entirely." And he lit the fire clumsily, for he had never once in his life laid a fire himself, and she let him struggle with it, and did not help watching with the small, dry amusement that was the nearest she came to tenderness. And at last it caught, and the light came up in the room, and the two of them sat together in it, without speaking. Two people who had wasted a great deal of time and had against all reasonable expectation a little left. The autumn came, and with it the slow keeping of every promise. Seraphine Vauclair lived in the dower cottage under the name of Madame Rue, and she grew thinner as the leaves turned, and she came up to the house on her good days to sit in the blue room with the morning sun across the floor and hold her daughter, and Camilla, who had no gift for sentiment and made no pretense of one, would sit with her. And the two women would talk of small things, of the child's first tooth, of whether she would be dark or fair, of the curious fact that she had begun to laugh at the antics of the kitchen cat, and they did not speak of the man they had in common, because there was nothing left to say of him. He had become, by some quiet alchemy, neither could have explained, almost beside the point. The child had two mothers now, one dying and one learning, and the dying one taught the learning one everything she could. In the time she had the way to settle a fretful infant, the song that worked when nothing else would, the particular hold the girl preferred, and Camilla, who had spent her life cataloguing things no one valued, found that, for the first time, she was being entrusted with knowledge that mattered, and she received it the way she received everything, attentively, exactly, forgetting nothing. Seraphine died in the first week of December, in the cottage, with a fire lit, and clean linen, and a physician who had been paid to be kind as well as competent, and with Camilla beside her holding her hand because she had asked for it, and there had been no one else to ask. It broke quietly. There was no drama in it, no last grand words. She simply grew tired, and then more tired, and then she slept. And at some point in the small hours, the sleep deepened into the other thing, and Camilla, who noticed everything, noticed the exact moment, and did not look away from it, holding the hand of a woman she had set out one morning in spring to despise, and had ended by honoring, and she thought that the world was a stranger and more merciful place than she had been raised to believe, and that she had nearly missed it entirely. The child, Juliet, grew. She was dark as her mother had been, with the considering mouth and the unmistakable eyes, and she grew up in the house at the end of the east passage, in the room that got the morning sun, and she was told, when she was old enough, the truth of where she came from, all of it, gently, because Camilla had decided that this child at least would not be raised on silence, having seen what silence does, and she was loved. Camilla, who had not been certain she was capable of it, discovered that she was capable of very little else, once the dam had finally gone, and the love when it came not as a flood, but as a tide. Slow and reliable and very deep, the kind that does not announce itself and does not recede. As for the others, the Duke's sister, Lady Marchmont, who had predicted ruin and scandal and the end of the family name, and who had refused for 2 years to enter a house that sheltered a bye-blow, eventually unbent, as such people do when she found that society had decided to find the whole affair romantic rather than disgraceful, Juliet's most ferocious champion, and claimed loudly and often to anyone who would listen that she had supported the arrangement from the very beginning, which no one who had been present believed, and which everyone, out of fondness, allowed her. The village physician who had attended Seraphine raised his fees on the strength of his ducal connection and was never short of patience again. The sister in the north who would not have her wrote, some years later, asking after the child, and was answered courteously and told nothing of consequence, the doorway she had refused to stand in having Bennet, then Camilla's settled opinion, permanently closed. And the kitchen cat, who had made the infant laugh, lived to an enormous and dignified old age, slept in the warmest chair in the house, as if by treaty, and declined, to the end of its long life, to show the slightest grade was only proper in a cat. And Camilla and her Duke grew old together, slowly, in the way of two people who began as strangers and chose, late, to become something better, and the choosing was the whole of it, made again each day, without grand words, in the laying of a fire and the keeping of a promise, and the long companionable silences that were at last rooms they were both inside of and not walls. If you have ever been the one who noticed everything and was thanked for nothing, who held the whole quiet weight of a house or a family or a love alone, and learned to call your loneliness a virtue because no one ever asked what it cost you, then you already know the warm hand that closed around Camilla's wrist that cold morn, and why she could not let it go. You know that being truly seen when at last it comes does not arrive like a trumpet. It arrives like a small fist tightening, like a fire finally catching, like someone kneeling on the hearthrug and asking only to be allowed to stay in the room. Tell me, before the embers go down, which moment stayed with you, the question asked flat and even at the start, or the held hand at the very end? Sit with me a while longer, here where it is warm, and when you are ready, draw your chair a little closer to the fire, for there is always another story waiting in the quiet, and I would be glad of your company when I tell it. Rest easy now. The night is long, and the fire is kind, and there is room enough for all of us beside it.